Hey, the Craig Fahle Show on Deadline Detroit is made possible by Samaritas, which is the state's largest private foster care and adoption agency. But they do a heck of a lot more than that. They've been serving homeless families, persons with disabilities, abused and trafficked women. They're also one of the largest resettlement agencies in the state. They provide market rate and affordable housing for seniors and HUD housing for families. And they also have skilled nursing, memory care, and rehab communities in Grand Rapids, Cadillac, and Saginaw. Samaritas, thanks for their support. Great organization doing great stuff all around the state.
Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to the week that was on Deadline Detroit, Zoom edition number 4, I do believe. Glad to have you with us on this day. And once again, it has been a very, very active week in our state, in our country, in the world. And I have my usual panelists here with me today. Nancy Derringer from Deadline Detroit. Hello, Nancy.
Hey, Craig.
Alan Lengel, of course, is the editor and co-founder of Deadline Detroit, who is with me as he is every week. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Attorney Steve Fishman rejoining us after a couple of week hiatus. We figured I'd give him a couple of weeks off there. We appreciate you being back, Steve. Thank you very much.
Happy to be here.
And of course, a new guest today, Lynn Walsh, a clinical psychologist joining us from the wilds of the East Side in Grosse Pointe, I do believe. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us. Really glad to have you here because you've been commenting all along as you watch these for the last several weeks. And, you know, I thought to myself this morning, I've got an attorney on and I've got a clinical psychologist. It's kind of like an episode of Law and Order. They can sort of break down the mindset of some of these.
We won't solve all the problems by the end of the episode, though, I can tell you.
No, probably not. Probably not. Well, let's start with this one, just because this is sort of breaking news as of this morning. It looks as if Kwame Kilpatrick, of course, the former mayor of the city of Detroit, sentenced to 28 years in federal prison for a multitude of crimes, is going to be released due to fears of COVID contamination at the prison that he is at down in Louisiana. We don't know if it's official at this point in time. We are working hard at confirmation right now at Deadline Detroit. In fact, we've talked to the foundation that reported it this morning. It looks like the guy might get out. And Steve, I want to start with you for just a second. What is the process here? What happens when they make a decision on whether or not to let somebody out? And does it necessarily mean he's free, or is there going to be some sort of confinement attached to this?
Well, the process is fairly simple. And this is unique, obviously. I mean, the First Step Act was passed by the Congress, signed by Trump, and that gives the vehicle. But what basically goes on is the inmate makes a request of the warden at his or her particular institution. The warden has 30 days to say yay or nay. If the warden says nay, then you can go to the sentencing judge and make an application, which I'm in the process of doing on a client of mine. But as it sounds like is happening here in Kwame's case, if the warden says yay, if the Bureau of Prisons says yes to your request, then what they can do, they cannot change a sentence. This is an important distinction, okay? All they can change is the location where you serve the sentence. The Bureau of Prisons, once a judge sentences, has pretty much exclusive jurisdiction over what happens to that person. If the person screws up, for instance, and loses his good time and does whatever, he can stay the entirety of his sentence, even though that's not necessarily what was intended. So what happens here, if this is true, he'll be released to home confinement. That doesn't mean he's released like you are when you go on parole, for instance, or on supervised release. But he'll be released and he'll have to stay in place. I guess if it's going to be at his ma's or wherever it would be, he'll have to stay there. And he'll have that as, he'll be serving a sentence in home confinement. That's basically what it is.
Well, and Alan, based on what we're hearing from Violet, who is actually doing a lot of research on this today, is that
she's still writing it. Why don't we don't want to put it out too soon.
That's right. We don't want to give up those clicks, everybody. So check out Deadline Detroit a little bit later on for the update.
But I can say this, that the prison where he's at, by the New York Times had been reporting, by the third week in April, there had been 7 COVID deaths, about 100 people there, and I think it may have included corrections officers as well, but 20 people have been hospitalized. So it's a pretty serious, it's a big complex down there. I think it's of different levels of security, but I would imagine, since Kwame, and Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine if he had such a lengthy term of 28 years that it wouldn't be in the minimum security, that it'd be at least a medium security.
No, that's not necessarily so, especially if he's been there as long as he has. There are guys in the state prison doing life sentences at low security places.
Oh, really? Okay. I stand.
But you're right. You're right about a couple things. You're right that they have different types of in the institution. There's a federal correctional institution. There might be a camp as well, which is a minimum security, and it's just a matter of how they word it when they send them where they send them.
Right.
Okay. Well, we are following this and we will watch. But the freak out that I've seen on social media already this morning about this news is remarkable. And Lynn, I mean, again, from a psychology perspective, this is a guy that is incredibly polarizing. There are some people that wish him to rot in jail for the rest of his life, and others have been cheering for his release for a long time. But what is it about this guy you think that gets people so worked up?
Actually familiar. This is a lot of what we see with Trump. I think it has to do with the nature of polarization. So, in most of these things that I'm going to bring up, I think are going to be familiar to you. You've probably all heard about, there have been different studies that look at group psychology and social psychology and whatnot. So usually the more pronounced a person's feelings or viewpoints are in opposite directions, it just continues to drive them in these opposite directions. And it also creates an us against them scenario, which generally is pretty motivating to people. So, I would say in the case of, I can't really speak to the case of Kwame other than, generally, but, he did have a lot of supporters, and in a lot of ways similar to Trump, it almost seemed like the more criticism he got from, the other side, the people who thought he was a criminal and a crook, the more criticism he got, the more his supporters coalesced behind him. And I mean, that's exactly what we see with Trump. So that has a lot to do with both group psychology and people's own individual psychology, their own individual personality traits that kind of leads them into whatever political party they end up in, eventually.
Well, we are definitely going to get into some of this group psychology stuff in just a little bit because there's some new polling data I want to get to a little bit later on. But I do want to talk about the president, of course, because he graced us with his presence yesterday. He came to our fair state. He was in Ypsilanti touring, right outside of Ypsi, touring a factory that Ford Motor Company had set up to make PPE. And he wore a mask, apparently, in certain parts of the factory. Briefly wore a mask, but then said he didn't wear a mask for the public parts because he didn't want the press to have the satisfaction of seeing him wear a mask, which I thought to myself, I'm sorry, I get no satisfaction out of seeing the president wear a mask. I get a sense of comfort that the guy is taking this seriously and actually wants to fix the problem. Right. Maybe I'm off the rails. Maybe I'm not part of the fake news. I'm not sure, but I don't see him wearing a mask as a sign of weakness. I see it as a sign of intelligence. And why doesn't he get that?
He's turned the mask thing into this political thing. Like if you are really a true Trumper, you won't wear a mask because the president doesn't.
Only pussies wear masks.
Instead of his whole the pandemic committee or whatever commission setting standards, which says we should be wearing masks, and then he has his vice president who's down in Georgia, sitting there with the Georgia governor having a hamburger, sitting at a restaurant without a mask. And granted, you don't want to wear one while you're trying to eat. It'd be a little messy. But, it's really sending such a terrible message here. And it's becoming, I almost every day in my apartment building here in Midtown am asking somebody in the lobby to wear a mask. And I try to do as politely as possible, but some just get very huffy, I had one kid, it was like 20, he was probably 20 years old. I said, "Hey, where's your mask?" He goes, "I don't wear one." I go, "What do you mean you don't wear one?" He goes, it's hard to breathe. And he goes, "I don't like the smell of it." And I'm like, well, maybe if you brush
your teeth, man. Well, you say you're being polite about it, but I sort of have this vision of Larry David in my head too. So
yeah, well,
as the third oldest person in this lineup here, I'm old enough to remember seatbelts. When seatbelts were first introduced, I was a little kid, and I loved them.
Tyranny. Talk about tyranny.
Yeah, exactly. But I remember there was a big PSA campaign from the ad council to get people to wear them. And there were some people who simply refused for a number of reasons. They had like dumb reasons, like it wrinkles my dress. But then they also had like, I'm a good driver. I don't need to wear a seatbelt. And so it literally took years for seatbelts to kind of become second nature. And for the idea that you can wear your seatbelt all the time, even if you're a good driver, because everyone else is not.
Who had that one friend back in those days that refused to wear their seatbelt, even if the buzzer was going off incessantly? So you're in the car with them and they're driving and all you can hear is this the whole time you're driving. And so like, oh, you just turn up the radio a little bit so you don't have to hear it anymore.
I joined one of those Facebook groups, Michiganders Against Excessive Quarantines. And the anti-mask chatter there it's really baffling. I mean, to me, it's kind of like, well, this is what they do in China, or in Asia. Everybody wears a mask, and because they have very crowded mass transit, and during cold and flu season, it's just considered a polite thing to do. But I mean, you would have women, particularly a lot of women, saying, they stopped me from going into Meijer and tried to make me wear that silly mask, a silly mask. That was the adjective I kept hearing.
Well, but there's a whole series of videos now making their way around social media over the last couple of days of so-called Karens, as they say. And forgive me, that's my mother's name and my sister-in-law's name. Yeah. No disrespect towards anybody actually named Karen. But it is. It's middle-aged white women complaining that that their rights are being taken away and demanding service and being generally crappy people to people who work in these stores and looking like quite, foolish while they do it. Is that what it's going to take?
I don't know.
For people to get the message that, this behavior this is not you being patriotic. This is you being rude.
I'm interested in going back to the original point about Trump pulling the stunt he pulled yesterday. I'm interested in Lynn's perception of it. To me, this whole thing is his deflecting, as usual, diverting attention from the fact that he's doing absolutely nothing and has done absolutely nothing to help the public about this virus. And from a psychologist's perspective, does that make sense to you?
That he's doing that?
That he's doing, he distracts, he deflects, he comes up with all this crazy shit because he doesn't want to talk about substance.
Yes, that's exactly right. And also, so he's actually, I mean, on one hand, I find him endlessly interesting. I think of him in a petri dish, and I wish I could study his brain, eventually, because he really is kind of an enigma, because he does appear to be genuinely dim, but at the same time, he has some pretty brilliant strategies. So one of them, him not wearing a mask, or at least him not wearing a mask for the media. And I would suspect he probably did wear a mask when the media couldn't see or we couldn't see. Because
I saw a picture of it. He did.
Yeah. So it's part of his dog whistle, or his, he's got a special voice for his followers, and then of course the right-wing media, mostly Fox News, that then repeats everything that he says. So it keeps people thinking in these very specific terms. And so if he says, I'm not going to wear a mask, of course the media is his enemy, which only serves him, because then he can say everything they say is false. So what he likes to do is, at any opportunity he has, he likes to kind of stick it to the media publicly, so that his supporters and his fans can continue to think that he's this, I'm not going to be what CNN wants me to be, or I'm not going to be what the Democrats want me to be. I'm going to stick it to them, screw them. And that's a big part of that group psychology, I think, with his supporters, is that, and it's interesting because largely GOP correlates with authoritarianism. Lots of studies show that, not just here, but in Europe, that most people who identify as right-wing, fascist, Republican, all studies correlate them a lot higher in authoritarianism. So in a way, I think from a psychology standpoint, them kind of, thumbing their nose at things that make perfect sense to us is in a way them being able to kind of thumb their nose at authoritarianism, which even though they believe in it, at times it feels good to, kind of say, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to this authority, which they see as like the governor of Michigan. Right.
I earlier before we got on, There was a message from on Facebook in the discussion about Trump yesterday, and a retired FBI agent goes on there and says, he goes, I really, and he's saying, yeah, Trump's a jerk. He says, but I like the idea that he acts like a CEO. He fires people who don't fall in line. He fires people who don't follow orders. And I wrote back and said, there's a constitution. It's great. You can be as a CEO, you can be a crook, you can be a liar, as long as the bottom line is that you're making money for the shareholders. It's great. Nobody cares. But when there's a constitution, he can't say this constitution is getting in the way of me being a CEO. But some people admire that, and it's it's hard.
Which is ridiculous because
it's a ridiculous argument, but you can't argue with them.
I know, but I mean, but for Trump claiming to be a CEO, period, is ridiculous. I mean, the Trump organization is a family business. I think I read somewhere during the campaign that at its absolute maximum, it had 50 employees. And in fact, there's more like a hardcore of about 25. The guy who runs that is not a CEO. He's just dad.
No, Nancy, what do I always say he is? We know exactly what he is. He's the head of the Gambino family. A criminal organization. We're back to the same point that we always wind up at. We're trying to think of the guy like a normal person. The reason I asked Lynn what I asked is part of the criminal mind is distraction. Nobody who's a crook like him wants to talk about their crookery all the time. They certainly don't want to talk about their incompetence. So what they do is, one thing is they threaten, he's a master of. Second thing, we fire, we get rid of people that don't listen to me. The third thing is we distract from when we don't want to talk about it, what an absolute blithering idiot I am. We want to talk about masks or something like that. It's the criminal mind, and he has it. And that's what everybody's have such a hard time understanding. Everybody tries to analyze him like he's a normal person. He's not. He's the head of a crime family. He's the son of a criminal. He's no different than the Gambinos or the Gottis. It's the same.
But do you think that, like, at the high point, that the leaders of the mob had the same sort of following in terms of the people that are willing to look beyond the obvious bad behavior and still follow along? I mean, did Al Capone have the same sort of public adulation of 39% of the people in Chicago at the time? I can't imagine they did.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised. You guys, I don't watch TV. I don't go to movies. But from what I hear from other people, there's tons of TV shows and movies about crooks and criminal families. A lot of people have, I know from people talking to me, for all the crooks I've represented in my life, people have kind of a subtle, again, I need a psychologist term. They have a little bit of admiration for it. They don't have the balls to do it themselves, but they think, ooh, look at the Black Mafia family. Look at Al Capone. I think they're maybe not 39%, but there's a decent percentage of people that are a little bit envious, or a little in awe of professional criminals, just because they can't believe people have that kind of chutzpah.
Lynn and I are both avid, multiple rewatch fans of The Sopranos.
Oh, I thought you were going to say The Wire, but okay.
Oh, The Wire and The Sopranos, yes. But The Sopranos, since we're dealing, well, they're both about crime families, but the Sopranos is more the traditional Italian mafia crime family. And this is something that David Chase, who is the creator of that show and, the showrunner, had to deal with early on in its run, because he had to start making Tony. I mean, he set out, I think, to show that he was a 360-degree human being, an evil, sociopathic human being, but still a human being. And what they found was that so many members of the audience just thought, oh, he's not a bad guy. Yeah, he kills people, but it's all in the game, that kind of thing. And I think that's the same thing you're talking about here, Steve. I mean, they just they admire that. And because he's not, snarling all the time, and he's capable of loving a dog or his daughter, then that makes him okay. So
one of my favorite lines is, and I'm maybe a little off on it, but when Tony says, I may not have ethics, but I got rules.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of ethics and rules, the ethics of suggesting that you are taking hydroxychloroquine, and doing this, even though numerous studies have suggested that this is not the right thing to do. Then, of course, this study comes out this morning suggesting, and this is a huge study, 96,000 patients, And they found that this is actually potentially harmful, really harmful. And if you're taking the mix that Trump is taking right now, you have a 400% increased chance of having heart arrhythmia from taking this drug along with that Z-Pack combination. This study is basically putting the final nail in the hydroxychloroquine coffin in terms of a treatment for COVID-19. The president is taking this stuff. I'm sorry, who do you blame for that? Do you blame the president for forcing his doctor to give him this, or do you blame the doctor for actually doing it, or do you think he's lying about taking
Time
it?
out.
He's
Time
lying.
out. Time out.
He's
Time
lying.
out.
Okay, there's a
Why would
line
you
there.
possibly believe, Greg? Why would you believe that he's ever taken one of those pills ever? This is a pathological career criminal liar. I'll bet you if you took a poll of the public after his 37%, no more than 20% would believe he. I don't believe he ever took one of them.
No.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, but
I think he was just making a big stink, like always, about something to distract.
Because it's that, but
is
also
he distracting from the fact
because
he's firing all the inspectors? What is he distracting from at this point?
from all of his other stuff that we talk about every week, all the different incompetent things that he does, or the authoritarian things that he does. That's why.
You know what? I think there have been anecdotally some cases where that drug has helped, or at least
we don't know.
Well, if it
was responsible for the helping or not, or if their own immune system actually took over.
like Karen Whitsett. Go ahead.
But it is being used in the hospitals as what an off-prescribed use. It is being used, and there have been anecdotally, but I think overall, it's the results have not been good, and there's been dangers in it. But there was a patient in Beaumont in Macomb County who swears by it. There was a state legislator who swears that it helped. It helped her. So he's going by those anecdotal things and ignoring a lot of the studies that are out there right now. But
well, I'm sorry. It sounds like he's waiting for a miracle here, Lynn. I mean, this is not. This is wishful thinking.
Ford Hospital came out. Ford is doing a clinical study with 3,000 people of frontline.
You're not convincing me, Langle. You're not going to convince me on this one.
Really
I'm looking at the data that came out with 96,000 patients. It's bad.
No, I'm not trying to. Let me finish, please. The Ford Hospital, the day of Trump saying that he was taking the drug, they came out with a press release defending their clinical study. I'm not defending. They were saying, we're doing this clinical study. We're giving it to first responders and healthcare workers to see. We feel obligated to see if it works. But they're not saying it does. But they felt obligated afterwards because I think they felt some like we've got to defend ourselves for carrying on with this clinical study. So I'm not defending the drug. I'm just saying I understand why he is running with it and ignoring very selectively taking information and then,
Well, Lynn, I mean, this is part of the reason I'm glad I have a psychologist on the program today, because this does get into people's minds. It gives them an idea that maybe there's some sort of conspiracy against the people who make this drug, or that there's something that we're not being told.
Right.
And it really sort of taps that little button in people's brains that there's more to this story than they're telling us.
Right. Well, I don't think he's taking it. I would bet my last dime on it that he's not taking it. I think, knowing what I know of him, and of course the caveat is I've never interviewed him, so none of this is a formal diagnosis. This is just observing patterns of behavior that, I've studied for the last 12 years as a psychologist. And I don't think he's taking it. I think there's maybe a couple reasons. The number one reason is because this subject of hydroxychloroquine has been such a source of shame for him. He doesn't show us what that shame is, but that's what narcissism is. It's feeling extremely shamed, and he's shamed all the time, every day. Nancy Pelosi this week did a great job of doing that. So he likes
morbidly obese. They should call them morbidly obese,
right. so to speak, or in the group or whatever it was. But no, I think he's defending against the criticism of it. So, and I also think that he absolutely plays this part of, I'm going to do what, if they tell me not to do it, I'm going to do it anyway. Because
like any 4-year-old.
Yeah. Well, and also that, really appeals to his base and all of his supporters. And from a standpoint of, we were talking about, you know, the authoritarianism and why people, like you were saying, Steve, why people would get off on the idea that he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So, you know, I know really briefly, like going back to Freud, you know, you've heard of the id, the ego, and the superego. So the superego is, you think of that as the authoritarianism, and that's the part that says, oh no, you're not supposed to do that, you know, that's against the rules. So people who are high in that, high in superego or authoritarianism, there's still that id, there's still that desire in there to you know, to do the wrong thing. And so when someone else does it, they get to have the satisfaction of experiencing it in extension through him. So this is why that appeals. So I think that if any Democrat or the media or whoever says, don't do this, or this doesn't make sense, you can be sure he's going to come out and say the opposite.
Well,
and people will respond to it.
A great example of that this week, because we have to move on to some different subjects that I need to get to. An interesting little spat between Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State in Michigan, and of course the president on whether or not to send out applications for absentee ballots to all the voters here in Michigan. That is what she's doing, I think at a cost of about $4.5 million to do it. So I've been getting some people complaining about that expenditure. For me, it seems a small price to pay to allow people to participate more fully and more safely, especially as we're looking at the possibility of another spike about November when we'd be going to the polls. But ridiculous. I mean, I talked about it on my podcast this week. I always say beware of anybody that is trying to make it harder for you to vote. They have a reason for doing it. They've looked at the numbers. They've looked at the trends. It's not about whether or not these things are fraudulent or there's the possibility of fraud. It's about minimizing the turnout and keeping you from voting and exercising your right in a democracy. And I'll tell you what, it's naked to me why they're doing this. And I thought Jocelyn Benson did the right thing. Sending an application to everybody is not the same as sending a ballot. And the president screwed that up in his original response. He fixed it. But again, throwing out this canard of voter fraud, Steve, I mean, it taps into that mindset that you know, everybody's out to get me and there's something illegal going on here. And that seems like an easy thing to tap into.
Go ahead,
Nance.
Well, I've got to look something up here, so you go ahead.
It flies in the face of the evidence, though, Craig. I mean, we've all read the same columns. There's no real evidence, not bullshit that you hear on right-wing news medias, that shows that the Democrats benefit any more than Republicans when you send out more ballots and people vote more by absentee. There have been Republicans winning, the Democrats winning, and anything I've read, unless you guys know something different, I haven't seen anything that suggests that it benefits one party other than the other.
No.
You know, look, if there's going to be voter fraud, I mean, we've seen it before where some ballots are not counted. Some are, you know, they find them three weeks later, they find 3 boxes of ballots somewhere. And those are people who actually showed up for the site. So there's a variety of.
And that's not necessarily voter fraud. I mean, elections are run by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. And, you know, sometimes I don't think we've ever I can't think of a case in recent memory where election screw-ups cost somebody, you know, an entire race. So you find 200 ballots, most
North Carolina, it cost the race for the guy who won because his dude was cheating.
That's right. Okay, but let me read something to you. Tim Alberta, who is this big, cheese at Politico, in the last few months has moved back to Michigan. He's from Michigan, and is writing about the presidential race from Michigan. It's instead of letter from Washington, they're called letter to Washington. But he went to this thing yesterday, and he said everybody wants to talk about voter fraud, and they've all picked up on this thing, you know, this dog whistle that he's blowing. Mm-hmm. And the last paragraph of his piece today, I'll just read it. He said, having obsessively covered the Republican Party from the ground up over the past decade, from the twilight of George W. Bush through the first term of Donald Trump, I thought I'd seen it all, heard it all. But this was new. The warp speed at which alarms about voter fraud, and specifically voting by mail, were synchronized from the president's Twitter feed to the lips of his voters, guarantees a volatile 5 months ahead and a potentially volcanic period thereafter.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
in November, which I think is increasingly likely to happen. Although after 2016, I'm not making any more predictions. But say he loses in November, who thinks the transition out is going to go smoothly?
This goes to what Craig was saying, Nancy. You know, when you were saying that the conspiracy theorists and whatnot. I mean, so that certainly plays to that, right?
Right.
I mean, they're setting up, especially because one of the things I think that's interesting about that is that he's only complaining about it in, I think, Michigan and Oregon. Even though, you know, they're doing the same thing in other states, right? Like, so to me, you know, that says that he is looking to sow, you know, possible questions of the, you know, the result of the election,
the legitimacy of the election.
Swing states, though, specifically only in the states that are swing states that he may lose, or that, you know, are Democratic states. So a state that's going to be solidly Republican, I'm sure he could give a shit, you know, about what goes on with mail-in voting there.
Well, it's only rigged if you lose. Don't you know that?
Right.
That's a simple truth when it comes to Donald Trump. It's only rigged if you lose, because remember, he was complaining about the 2016 election being rigged before the vote took place. And then when he won, he's like, this was an honest and fair election. And it was a mandate of the people, even though he lost the popular vote. So clearly,
and it was rigged. It was rigged by the Russians in his favor. But, you know, he doesn't want to talk about that.
No. That's a hoax. Just like the
sorry,
coronavirus.
I want to believe.
I want to believe. Yeah. Okay. Well, hold on a second. I do want to get to this too before we wrap up, and we've got a little bit of time. But wow, Infrastructure Week. Is it Infrastructure Week yet? Because we need it. Geez, what is going on up in Midland? You see these privately owned dams. There's fighting going on between the Eagle Department and, of course, the private owner of this dam as to who's responsible. It was, of course, warned back in 2018 that this thing could fail, and it did. Downtown Midland is in a lot of trouble. This is a huge, huge problem, and again, indicative of the fact that for the past 3 decades, we've been operating under this mantra that taxing people less and, you know, trickling down is going to take care of this. What we have is woefully underfunded infrastructure all across the country, and it's coming back to bite us in the ass yet again.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you know, we had a freeway collapse in Minneapolis a few years ago. You know, look for this to happen more often. I remember, you know, at my last job, there was a story early on, like 8 years ago, about how many of these dams are in Michigan. And a lot of them are like this one in Midland where they're privately owned. So, you know, the government either has to seize them and then do the work itself, or the owner has to be compelled somehow to do it. And, you know, this is going to be, the fallout from this particular incident is going to last for years. This is another Flint disaster.
Our infrastructure is sort of like you take your car in, you don't have a lot of money, you take your car in, and the mechanic says, I can do a little fix here, and I don't know how long it'll last, maybe a half a year, maybe a year. And you say, oh, can I take a chance? Yeah, sure, take a chance. And then
I may sell the car anyway. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so that's how infrastructure, I mean, we never go, oh my God, let's really take a thorough look at infrastructure. When things start, like disasters happen, like here, Katrina, other places, then we say, oh, maybe we should look at our infrastructure.
Well, and those earthen dams, or at least that was a dike with a spillway in the middle of it, which was totally inadequate. But those things I spent 20 years living in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is a city that floods often. And those dikes, those earthen dikes, if they're not reinforced with sandbags in situations like we had last week or this week, I've heard them described as when they get saturated, they have the consistency of toothpaste. That's, you can like literally stick your finger in it. And so, I mean, there are going to be multiple failures. There's going to be blame gaming for at least the rest of the year and well into next year. I mean, this is going to be a story that's going to have long legs. But yeah, it's awful.
Doesn't what Alan's saying, what Alan was saying, what you're also saying, Nancy, isn't that really more of a commentary on how unserious the Congress really is? I mean, they get together, like you guys said, for 30 years. Let's say it's been evident that we need all this kind of money. And what do? They give tax cuts to people who live in Greenwich, Connecticut. I just read an article in the New Yorker. I could hardly go to sleep. I was ready to throw up. And all these people who support Republicans, because even though they're billionaires, they don't want to pay tax. They don't want anybody serious there. And I think that's what you guys are all saying, is that
you're exactly right.
It's not a serious country. We're not a serious country.
And here we have, of course, now we're in this pandemic and we're hemorrhaging money. Have been the time to start a giant infrastructure project, a Manhattan project or not the Manhattan project, what is it? The Marshall Plan for this country, where we go in and we just kind of say, we've been putting this off too long. It's like what happens to your house after 20 years or so, and suddenly it's a roof and then it's a basement and it's all this other crap.
Well, hey, look, ask any drain commissioner around the country, what they're facing right now. They've all got massive, massive investments that need to be made to keep the system working safe. Ask Candace Miller. She had to deal with the fat bird problem.
Candace Miller can go on for an hour about that. Yeah,
remember the giant drain failure up in Fraser a couple of summers ago? That was a massive thing. Now, if you would have just maintained it along the way, the cost of this would be a lot lower to the taxpayer than they are, and they'd also be more consistent. Most people don't pay cash for a car up front. You pay a little off over time. That's what we should have been doing this whole time, yet we don't think that way anymore. And as long as you can't see it, we don't think about it until, of course, you've got sewage coming up in your basement, and all of a sudden you're like, gee, maybe we should do something about this.
Well, and this polarization has led to this idea that people don't feel that they have any responsibility for anyone outside of their own yard. And so you say, we're going to put in we're going to tax everyone in the country and we're going to improve freeways, and it's like, well, I don't drive on any of them freeways. I don't know why I should have to pay for that, and it's like, that's not, I still vote for tax levies and I don't have a kid in school anymore, but because schools are good, freeways are good, all these things are good for the whole country. So, anyway.
All right. Well, real quick, before we get to Schmuck of the Week, I do want to talk about this poll data. And this is something I wanted to run by Lynn as well, because you take a look at a poll. This was done by the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce. This isn't some, liberal whack job poll here. But it says overall, 86% of Michigan voters surveyed believe that the virus is a threat to public health. Okay, 86% of Michigan voters surveyed. However, only 58% among strongly Republican men thought that the virus is a threat to public health. Now, let me keep going here. Michigan voters overall also overwhelmingly agreed with the governor, 69 to 22%, that the stay-at-home orders were the right thing to do. 11% of Michigan voters surveyed said they do not regularly wear a mask. But here's what we've got. 81% saying they do wear masks. 90% of Democrats saying they wear masks, 80% of independents, and 72% of Republican women say they wear masks. But less than half, 49% of Republican men say they wear masks, with a percentage of those who do not especially high for those under the age of 50. So basically what we've got is white Republican men who think that this is all a hoax. Everybody else seems to think that this is something we need to take seriously. Lynn, there's some groupthink going on here. What's behind it, you think?
Well, okay, so part of this is going to be, I think, most of this I'd say is explained by, like I said a minute ago, anything that a Democrat says is a good idea, you can be sure now that, a Republican's it's going to be politicized, so they'll want to do the exact opposite. So, they might be inclined to drink bleach. If somebody says, if the Democrats say don't drink bleach, people are influenced, simply by hatred of each other, the polarization of the groups. But with white men, this isn't a simple, this is not a simple explanation. It's very complex as to why people are the way they are. But with white men, you've got, typically, no offense to our gentlemen here, but typically
we're
men.
Jews. We're not white guys. We're Jews.
Okay, all right.
I am. I'm a white guy.
There's a white guy up on top there.
Most people can kind of say anecdotally, the men in their family are more disinclined to go to a doctor if, even if they're having, heart pains or one side of their bodies, it's numb, they'll put off going to the doctor. They just tend to not want to seek care or, think they're kind of invincible. So there's that. But then, with white men, what it really is, I think one of the biggest social psychology explanations for the white man thing, not just with this, but with everything, is this idea of social dominance. So this is not news to anyone, I think, but it really does come down to, an anger against what they see as a society that is moving in a direction that is different from the one that they identify with and that they feel and felt most comfortable in. So, the idea of social dominance tells us that white Republican men are always going to kind of be in that group, that outlier group. When you see these things that make no sense, white Republican men typically are going to, be sort of in their own, world, where they think, okay, all the, the Democrats, the women, the blah, 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 they all say that this is scientists, they all say that this is the thing we should do. Well, that's bullshit. I don't believe that.
What do they know anyway? Yeah.
What do they know? All right. We are running out of time here, and we definitely have to get to Schmuck of the Week. I have a good one. I'm not going to go first. Who wants to go first with their Schmuck of the Week nominee?
Nancy.
I'll go first.
All right.
Don
Nancy
Jr.
gets to go first. Don Jr.
Why? Okay. Don Jr.
That's a good one. I know why, but you tell us.
Post up where he essentially called Joe Biden a pedophile. Okay?
Yes.
It was some see you later alligator, after a while pedophile. That was it. And it just reminded me of what awful people this entire family is and what they will do to get ahead.
Yeah,
including calling people pedophiles. Basically.
He's in the running, and of course he also said that the Democrats were rooting for people to die so Trump would look bad. I think he said, or that was Eric Trump, excuse me. So the Trump brothers are both up there.
Though, to actually calling someone a pedophile?
I don't know. Maybe is he the head of QAnon now?
Has sex with children. All right.
He might be Q, Nancy. He could be the QAnon leader. All right.
Right. Exactly. Okay.
Who's next? Langle. What you got?
Of the week. You know what? I am coming a little unprepared for this at this point. I would say.
I'll go, Alan. You can think.
Yes.
You want me to go? And you think.
Okay.
It's funny. This must be the week since the trophy has been retired in the name of Donald Trump. This must be the week for the Trump boys, because Eric Trump is my nominee, just based on those two things that he said. That number one, they're rooting for people to die. That number two, they're hyping the thing. It's actually three things. Number two, they're hyping it because they don't want his daddy to be able to have his rallies with 50,000 people in arenas. And then number three, of course, which is the best, November the 3rd, the day after the election, the coronavirus will be over. It'll stop completely. Right. So I think he's Schmuck of the Week. We have to have a debate of whether or not any Trump can win a trophy that's been retired in the name of their father.
I know. I realize.
They don't remember. They've all said they don't want to trade on their dad's name. So, they've earned this on their own. They earned this on their own. They did this by being their own special type of idiot.
Okay, right. I do have.
Okay, go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say, maybe collectively, the Schmuck of the Week are the people, the hairstylists or whatever, who were cutting hair on the front, in front of the Capitol the other day. I mean, if you're going to do it, at least wear a mask. And they're not wearing a mask, so that just drives me crazy. That you want to be part of the solution. Then and I get it. Economically, there's some hardships there, and you certainly have a right to speak out about it. But at least give the people a reason to open up the businesses, and don't be a schmuck about it.
And here's the thing, I have crap in my hair right now. If I didn't, I would look like Beethoven on his worst day. Okay, it's long. I put crap in my hair that I bought at the store legally, and it keeps it sort of tamed for a little while, controlled for a little while, long enough for me to do these videos. And then the rest of the time, I don't care. Everybody else can do this. Your hair will be okay. You can always cut it later.
I've been cutting my own hair.
Well, I can.
It looks like
fabulous.
it too.
It looks like it. Okay. I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
It was like a big soft pitch over the plate, so I had to hit it.
Lynn, what do you got?
All right. So, So I didn't know that you couldn't nominate Trump's, but mine is.
Well, it's named after him, so.
Okay. So mine is Melania.
Okay.
Because I tortured myself last night to watch the blurb of her on the CNN town hall, which was pre-recorded. So she was featured in the town hall, but it was pre-recorded. So of course she couldn't answer any questions or, whatever. It was essentially like a campaign ad, I guess. But her speech was, of course she talked about the normal things, and at some point in there was a be best, and just the hypocrisy, of her, taking my time to talk about how proud we are of you and how much the president and I support you and how we have so much sympathy. It's like we watch him talk. We see, what you're talking about is a fantasy. This is not a guy, that gives two shits about, the things that you're talking about. So mine is Melania. She's never been one of my favorites anyway, but that speech that put it over the edge for me.
What,
All right.
Lynn, the
ahead,
first
Nancy.
rule of sex work, you do it the way the customer wants it. So there you go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay. And my nominee is a person named Kurt Johnston Duncan. Now, if you don't know Kurt Johnston Duncan, he is a man who lives in Pickford in Chippewa County. That's up in the UP.
I know Pickford. Go ahead.
There you go. This guy was charged with 125 wildlife crimes. He has killed 18 wolves in the last 18 months, as well as killing and disposing of 3 bald eagles. And not only that, other species involved in the charges include deer, turkey, bears, and bobcats. Now, interesting, he was doing this for a variety of reasons, including, according to the Detroit News release, crafts, selling or disposing of them. And he also stated that he was catching the animals because he could and, quote, likes to do it.
Wow.
So 56-year-old dude up in the UP, Kurt Johnston Duncan, killing bears, bobcats, bald eagles, and of course wolves, is my schmuck of the week.
He needs to drive about 20 miles north and enjoy the nightlife possibilities of Sault Ste. Marie. So there you go.
Well, he's in a little bit of trouble. 125 counts of wildlife crimes. He's going to spend
he needs Steve Fishman to be his lawyer. So.
Well, there you go, Steve. There might be some federal statutes that he violated there with the bald eagles, I'm guessing, right?
It's okay. I'm sure he can find somebody up there that will sympathize with his cause. You know what I mean?
Well, it's entirely possible. But it's not like this guy's a rancher protecting his herd. He just likes killing stuff. So that's why he's elevated to schmuck of the week for me. Okay. All right. We got to wrap this up. But I have to ask, we are now free to gather in groups of 10 or less. Is that altering your plans for the holiday weekend? No.
I didn't know it was a holiday weekend until yesterday, because every day is Groundhog Day. And the only reason I knew was I got an email from one of the federal judge's case manager wishing me a really enjoyable, lengthy weekend. And I'm thinking to myself, what's the difference with this weekend? And somebody told me it was Memorial Weekend.
I think it's not. I mean, I may hang out. I may hang out with, socially distanced in someone's backyard with, 2 or 3 friends, but I think it's ridiculous. I mean, there's so much political pressure on the governors, and I understand, we do want to move the economy forward, but because Donald Trump says it's okay doesn't mean it's so. So I think we still have to take a lot of precautions, including wearing a mask, social distancing, and certainly not getting into big crowds. I mean, you see people out there who are, not wearing masks or elbow to elbow with people, and they think it's over, where they're predicting now within a month, there could be a second wave down in the South because they've opened up so quickly and people are ignoring all the social distancing issues. So,
yep.
Lynn, how about you?
Well, if I have any social interaction this week, it'll be what it is even not during quarantine, which is hanging out with Nancy and her husband, Alan. Out of my social circle, and my husband and my dog.
I'm gonna ride my...
No, I mean, no. I mean, I don't see any reason, there's no compelling reason to do something that, probably could put you at risk. Maybe it doesn't, but we'll probably get together with a couple people and
Well,
know,
like I said,
in the
six
backyard.
6 feet apart. That's the key.
Exactly.
But yeah, and for those of you who are thinking about heading up north to places like Traverse City and Petoskey, there are some pretty clear signs out there, especially look this up on the internet. Look at the marquee at the State Theater in downtown Traverse City on High Street there. I believe it's on High Street is the name of it. But their sign is basically saying, we don't want you here. So keep that in mind. They're not ready yet. All right, everybody, we got to wrap up the week that was. Steve Fishman, thank you as always for being here. Appreciate it very much. Lynn Walsh, great to have you. Welcome aboard, and we'll have you back. Ellen Lengel and Nancy Derringer, as always, we appreciate your help. Thanks to Michael Lucido for engineering this broadcast. Thanks as well to Samaritas for sponsoring this program. I really do appreciate them and the work that they are getting done during this time. There's a lot of important stuff there. Again, go to DeadlineDetroit.com for all your news needs. There's going to be some breaking news throughout the day today, so keep your eye there on what's happening with Kwame Kilpatrick and a number of other stories that we'll be doing. And we're working on some cool interviews and stuff for you to take a look at over the course of the next few days. So go to DeadlineDetroit.com. We appreciate it very much. This has been the week that was. Bye, everybody. Enjoy your holiday weekend and maybe that little bit of extra freedom that you get. And Alan?
Stay home safely.
My name's ML Elric. I'm an investigative reporter and a connoisseur of fine yogurts. I know a little bit about Detroit. I know a little bit about deadlines. And I'm asking you to become a member of DeadlineDetroit.com. Like me, I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do. I'm making a monthly donation. My wife is making a monthly donation. I know that seems redundant, but they need the money, and the money goes to a good place. Getting the story out, getting the truth out. Because if we don't support local journalism, there's some people a couple blocks away from here who are going to get away with a whole bunch of stuff that's going to cost you a whole lot more than just a few bucks out of your pocket every month. Go to DeadlineDetroit.com, become a member. You'll see it's really easy at the top of the website. Give early, give often, give generously. Just give a damn. That's the best way I know how.
Hey, the Craig Fahle Show on Deadline Detroit is made possible by Samaritas, which is the state's largest private foster care and adoption agency. But they do a heck of a lot more than that. They've been serving homeless families, persons with disabilities, abused and trafficked women. They're also one of the largest resettlement agencies in the state. They provide market rate and affordable housing for seniors and HUD housing for families. And they also have skilled nursing, memory care, and rehab communities in Grand Rapids, Cadillac, and Saginaw. Samaritas, thanks for their support. Great organization doing great stuff all around the state.